Okay, glad to see Alyssa and Grant and Libby. Do this if you would. Make sure you mute your microphone so we don't hear your dog or the sports bar you're at while you're listening to this. I'm just kidding. Anyway, we've got a few minutes. I guess we can go ahead and get started. Those people who come in a little bit late, we can catch them. They can catch it on the front side. We are in the week of the 25th and the 27th. And we had a couple of assignments that were due, one that's due today, and this is the interactive session over on pages 132 to 133. And then we have the hands-on project that's due on the 29th, and then, of course, Loudon Chapter 5. I want to take some time today to go over some material over there in Loudon Chapter 5 to talk about the infrastructure, and I'm going to put this on. Hopefully you'll get this as a slideshow. I would assume you would. Let's see if we can do this, and it will. Very good. Since I've got it on this other screen top. I'm going to go back here for just a second and want to talk a little bit about this, and let me get this down to a manageable thing. And I'll start the share over here. This is, this will be about as pedantic as you're going to see me get, but I do want to go through each of these with you and talk about the internet and the infrastructure, because what they're talking about here is the physical piece of it. Now, most people get confused, and they use the term, I even will do it myself, use the term internet and web interchangeably. That is not accurate. The internet is the backbone, the infrastructure that carries web pages and data, okay? The internet was originated by DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Program Agency of the United States government. And this was back in the 1960s and 70s. DARPA was created, in the event of a nuclear war, what was then the Soviet Union, that was this underground phone system, high density phone system to keep government operating, because the United States government had all kinds of places down deep in the bottom of mines and so forth, so the government could try to function, or they could try to communicate. Now, that changed back in the of course in the 90s with the development of web pages, and then eventually the internet was the DARPA net, which it was known, was expanded to take on commercial development, and then the pipeline as we know it now has been laid over the past 20 some odd years. I sent my first email in 1978. I used a modem that was about half the size of a kitchen table and had a huge, long, screeching sound, and it took about 45 minutes to send a paragraph. And basically, then it just kind of evolved. The very first, there really were the first discussion boards, for example. They were really not web pages; they were file sharing. And then as web pages were developed and web programming is developed, we have what we have today, the World Wide Web. So I want to just walk you through some of that and some of the infrastructure, and then some other materials that I think lend themselves to what we're talking about. So I'm going to open, first of all, Figure 5.1 and talk to you about it for just a moment. And basically, this just, again, gives us the overview of this, where services and infrastructure are fed in to customer services, supplier service, enterprise, and of course these three pieces of the puzzle: the business strategy, the IT strategy, and the information technology that combine to bring those together. Now, the second piece of this, and just preview this for a minute, will show you basically how this all works. Data is sent throughout the internet, and he probably covered some of this in 1103, so I'm not going to go over it again. The way that we move data throughout the internet is by what we call packet arrangements, and we chop and slice the packets so we can send them along the fastest route. And part of the web address is that's all chopped up and divided up, and so then wherever there's a way to send something faster, it gets sent through, so that the network is always being maximized and its usage is always being maximized. And that's essentially what they're talking about. Now, as they show you here, this is a client end on the far left, and then into the internet, okay? A web server, an application server, then data that might come over to, say, HR. So that's pretty much it. Now, they have some other things here that show you Moore's Law, okay? And talking about the processing power, and he's saying it's exponential every 2 years. And we keep finding faster and faster ways to compute. And since we do, we have to have infrastructure to keep up with it. Now, the very first computers that operated used vacuum tubes, like the very first television sets. But with the advent of the microchip, okay, that was when we began to see things really take off. And today, the limitations that are posed on our computing prowess, that is how fast we can compute data, are physical, and there are issues of physics. And that is, when we move the data across any kind of grid, and you have the doors that open and close, so we get those ones and zeros and so forth, it creates heat, it creates friction. And so the question is okay, how hot can we get a chip before the thing melts? And if you get with any computer, you're going to find it has to have some type of ventilation because it generates heat. And that's the friction of moving all that, moving those moving those zeros and ones, those bits across a surface. So that's a question that they'll have. That people are trying to find different ways. One of the things that made the revolution in databases possible was that we were able to move away from just simply writing code that pointed to a particular spot in a computer. A table would take up physical space, and then if you ran a query, that would take up space. And with the development of object-oriented programming, we were able to write queries that go through it and pull data, but we don't create another physical set. What gets stored is the code itself. Now, they have some other data here, and I'm just basically going through Figure 5 that shows you the decreasing costs, okay, in terms of the price to handle data. And it's exceptional. You can see how much it's fallen, and that's because we are able to make smaller and better transistors and better and smaller chips. Everything is predicated on that. And the students who are taking policy right with me right now are seeing that same kind of thing. They're selling. What are we selling? Oh, my brain just went dead. But we're basically, what's going on is they're in what we call the northwest to southeast drift, where people want higher performance and a lower cost and a lower size. So that's primarily what's going on. This will give you an idea of some of the newer materials we're talking about, like nanotubes. Of course, the textbook shows you some of these examples to try to do some computing, some new materials. And this figure shows you how the cost of data storage, okay, has changed so much over the years. Now, as you can see, that cost is climbing a little bit because we're just storing more and more stuff and all kinds of things. And it ranges from just simple text files to videos, movies, you name it, we've got it. Now, Figure 5.8 shows you the cost per bit and how that's dropped and flattened itself out. But again, that's going to spike upwards because as more and more people on the planet get connected, those costs are just going to be driven up. A lot of times they're using technologies that are not state of the art, so that causes some issues as well. Figure 5.9 is a good one because it shows you what we call the infrastructure or ecosystem, and these are the pieces that all fit together in IT. Now, IT.
That's not that bad. You got enough time to take your 2-hour nap.
Who was in this business face what we call the last mile problem. So what are you talking about? Well, what I'm saying is it's on a per square foot or per square mile basis, it's cheaper to send everything, and then it is down a pipeline than it is to branch off to an individual
class right here, right? So it's probably just going to play for like 45 minutes to an hour.
And whoever out there is
done,
talking,
you could just
make sure you would, if you would, and put your computer on. We got somebody out there that's got their, and I guess I'll mute it.
Are you listening?
No. I ain't doing shit today.
I'm not doing shit either, bro.
All right. And let's see who else I need to mute. So everyone's having a beer party while we're having class. So, all right, now let me go on forward here. This other figure, 510, I'll pop it open for just a second. We'll preview it. This pretty much shows you everything in terms of what we call cloud computing, the devices to access it, and then the different ways we move that data to process it, whether it's for application, content, ID management. The thing to understand is that each of the major computer, well, Apple is probably the best example of what they call somebody who utilizes what they call a closed garden, and that a walled garden, and that is only Apple stuff works with Apple stuff, and everything and everybody has to adapt to Apple or that won't work. And they do that for security reasons as much as anything. That's pretty much, except for a few things near the end and talking about some of these different standards that are there for coding and so forth. And again, we'll open up this very last one, which just shows you kind of the idea of all of these. We have these server farms, and they just, the huge amounts of data that they store, that they move. It's hard for people to understand how much data we're moving. So we'll pop back up here for just a sec, okay? And the interactive session there that was over on pages 132 and 133 deals with Eric Snowden. And I'll be interested to see what you had to say about it. I haven't looked at them yet, and I will be taking a look at them. And it was basically a question of whether you thought basically an opinion regarding him. Was he a traitor, or was he trying to protect people's privacy? He's a very controversial figure, okay? But he's not the only person involved in this kind of thing, and this is not the only kind of issue that's going on out there. Here's a link, and this is kind of your webinar for today, or a web safari. This company was sending lists, guest lists, to the immigration office, and they've decided they're not going to do that. But the company owns them is Go Hospitality, but they were sending lists of people to the immigration service, and obviously the immigration service was checking names. And this is one of these issues where whatever possessed them to do this, who knows? But it's had some pushback for them, and so they've decided they're not going to do that anymore. And then here's just this is from the New York Times, an article about how to use Twitter and Facebook for travel information and for emergency travel information. Excuse me. So you can use those, but again, some privacy issues are attached to them. but certainly they can be useful. So this is a two-edged sword in the sense that, you know, we have these data, and people can access them and learn things about us that we may not want them to know. On the other hand, they can be a benefit to us. Now, this is the very first, as it says, the very first detailed public map of the internet infrastructure. As I told you, it evolved over time once it got commercialized, okay? And this, we'll close that ad off there. But you'll be able to see. Here are, as you can see, the major trunk lines, okay? And the major cables. These are literally just giant cables that are buried underground. And one of those major trunk lines runs not too far from, runs between Oklahoma City and Shawnee, if I'm not mistaken. And so we're able to get a little bit faster access to the internet because we're near one of these trunk lines. But as you can see, there are some parts of the country that are still relatively not connected. And then you can see the density along the coasts. Well, we've known this stuff is here, but what's happened is over time, okay, all of this network was built by commercial interests, not by the federal government. As I told you before, the federal government built the first one, and then commercial interests came and built these on as the internet grew and became popular, etc. So that is something you want to take a look at. Now, one of the things that's going on right now, and they mentioned this here in this article, is the use of satellites to provide internet access for people. Now, if you're aware of SiriusXM, they're a satellite service. What they basically do is they stream programming from the web up to a satellite, then back down to people's vehicles and to their phones. Folks like Zuckerberg at Facebook have said, you know, I think maybe we should try to do this. So the bottom line is folks are looking at some different ways to do this because this is extremely expensive to do this, but we are trying to get some coverage. But this is the first time we'd ever seen, anybody had ever seen that actual map or detailed map. Now, I wouldn't be able to talk about the infrastructure if I didn't talk about what's known as the deep web or the dark net, okay? And there are all kinds of marketplaces, websites for exchanging things. People who are hackers will sell data, they'll sell programming, and this is part of that issue. And these folks are dark. They call them the dark web because they're not easily accessible through a regular search process. And here's the hidden wiki, okay? And you would never find them just out there. You'd have to really look hard, and you'd have to know who they are, okay? These are also people that will handle. Silk Road is one that handled the bitcoins and had the big controversy. So when we talk about this infrastructure, okay, and we talk about how the internet and the web are structured, web pages and access to them can be made dark and can require something that's encrypted to get in. Government agencies do this. I'm sure that people who are out there I know that people who are hackers and sell data, they do the same thing. And so it's one of these things that it's hard to get through. For example, this site only works with a particular type of browser. And let me say this, I would not, if I were you, go there. Because if you're fooling around with those people, they will get you. They can do some bad stuff to your computer, probably get your data. So it's not a place for Pippi to be. Now, WikiLeaks is probably the most important of them, okay? And you've heard about this guy. He's over in an embassy. He's been there since 2012. He certainly is somebody who is was what we would call back on the deep web, because he's calling has all this data that he's called from U.S. agencies, and that he kind of just dribbles it out over time. Then Tor shops, okay, and there's if you've got illegal stuff to sell, this is the browser you use. There's this whole place where people can buy weapons, they can buy drugs, and it's not. Let me put it like this: it's the bad part of town, and you don't want to go there, but it does exist, and a lot of people don't know that it exists as part of this, what we call this deep web. There are also secure places out there, for example, that the United States government has. And so when you see some of these leaks that have occurred, these are places that people have walked out with classified data or downloaded classified data, whatever they've done. Now, I'm going to go back here for just a second as we're kind of going through this. And we're going to talk for a moment about the smart products. When we talk about the infrastructure of the internet, it's important for you to understand how that's, and the web, and understand how that's all put together, okay? That's very, very important. But what is really important for you to understand is that when we do this, when we connect homes, we connect products, we connect cars, they're out there. And if good people can connect to them, bad people can connect to them. And so a major concern right now is, could people tap into our infrastructure? Could they go in, say, Oklahoma City and change all the stoplights so that the stoplights are working the opposite of what they should be for one direction? And they could disrupt the entire city, or airports, anything like this. We do know now, it's coming to light, that during the 2016 election, that about 20 or 21 states were being sniffed out, their data and on voter records by a foreign agent, probably, or an agent of a government, probably the Russians. And they were going through and trying to penetrate databases to get voter lists. And the one thing that's kept us from really having an issue is that all the voter registration data has been kept separate from all of the mechanical stuff where votes are actually cast. And one of the reasons there's been so much resistance to letting you and I go online and just vote is that if we do, you got to link the two of them up. And if you do, you could have some massive problems. We do know there were some instances during the election when people were sent from precinct to precinct and told, no, you're not eligible to vote, when they had a card and they had done everything they should. Well, that's one of the issues, some of the issues we have. And I wanted to talk about one of the things that the text mentions this, the NSA PRISM program, okay? This is a program that really was launched as a result of 9/11, and things have just kind of evolved over time. After 9/11, there was a tremendous amount of angst and conversation about the fact that we knew that these people were here. We knew they were doing odd things, like they're out in Arizona learning how to fly a commercial airliner. we knew that there was a guy out there by the name of bin Laden who had made some threats, and who had prior to that we had two incidents that really should have hit everybody's radar. One was the bombing of the ship USS Cole, and the second the second one involved the first attempt on bombing the New York Trade Center. You know, there were two attempts. There is an excellent documentary on PBS about, he was called The Man Who Knew Too Much. He was an agent who tracked bin Laden and knew that bin Laden was a threat. And in fact, the guy left the FBI, went to work, and unfortunately, he was the head of security at the World Trade Center and lost his life. So as all of this came out, people begin to say, we've got to get some centralized things pulled together. Now, we have an agency called the Central Intelligence Agency in the United States, okay? We also have the National Defense National Defense Intelligence Agency. We have about 17 agents in the FBI, and they all kind of have their own little corner of the world. Typically, the CIA has been foreign. The FBI has handled domestic things. But there's been this issue of people talking to each other and so forth. So the NSA Guardian program, PRISM program came to light. And this was really pushed. This was developed during the Bush administration, and then really accelerated and put into practice by the Obama administration. Most people don't know this, but during the Obama administration, there were more people prosecuted for leaking government information than at under any other administration. And they really went after people. And this PRISM program is a way that allows the NSA, National Security Agency, to go in and to sniff out your data, find out what you're doing, who you're emailing, your purchases, etc. Now, you've probably heard a lot of stuff about it. You've probably heard about wiretapping and that type of thing. For any agency to listen to your phone calls, or even just get a list of your phone calls, they have to go get a court order. They can't do it without that. If it's a foreigner, that's a whole different matter. Or if you are talking to someone overseas, let's say you have a friend in Ecuador or wherever, the government has the right to monitor that conversation, and I mean to get every single last word of it. And this is, again, part of this post 9/11 word that we've heard in. And this has been an effort, okay, to and this is the Guardian, which is a newspaper in Great Britain, to utilize Google and Apple data, and to go in and to surreptitiously gather information. Now, you hear the term, people talk about the term metadata. What they're talking about is, let's say, phone numbers. Metadata would be, you have a whole bunch of calls in area code 405, for example. That's metadata. Now, if the government got a list of every single phone call you made, and that's a whole different thing. But if you've got phone calls to a particular area code, let's say you're making international calls, and you're calling Yemen a whole lot, I guarantee you will hit somebody's radar. Okay, and there's just absolutely no part of that. So having this infrastructure, okay, allows people like governments to look at these kinds of things. And this is an excellent article talking about PRISM and all of the issues that are involved with it. And it, again, is one of those things where it's trying to balance our safety and our privacy. It's a tough choice. So there's a resource there in that PDF I thought would be useful for you to see. I think you would want to read it. The United States is really trying to come to terms with how much we can invade people's privacy. If you go to Europe, if you go to Great Britain, for example, they have video cameras almost everywhere, and so they're videotaping stuff 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We don't have that widespread use yet, but my hunch is if we have too many more incidents, if we have another major attack on American soil, it will really accelerate and change. Now, while you've heard about Eric Snowden, okay, I also want to tell you about someone who's about 45 or 50 years ago was important, and this is, you may have studied this in your history class, the Pentagon Papers. There's a man by the name of Daniel Ellsworth, and he was had discovered a whole bunch of documents that what they really were was a gigantic report of about 35 to 40 experts, and this was commissioned by I think Eisenhower might have commissioned it, and then Kennedy kept it going, and then Johnson, President Kennedy and President Johnson. But what they were trying to do is figure out, how did we get in Vietnam? What are the chances we have of winning that war? what are the chances we have of making an exit that's graceful? And what is it all about? And how many troops would they need? Just all kinds of details. And this is a good article, an excellent article from the New York Times that talks about Daniel Ellsberg. Now, Mr. Ellsberg was an anti-war activist, and one of the ways that there was an attempt to discredit him, and that was the FBI found out that Mr. Ellsberg had been seeing a psychiatrist. And so the FBI raided the psychiatrist's office, okay? And imagine that you have criticized the government, and the next thing you know, your medical records are being gone through. This is what happened with him. And this is all in that era of time also when we had Watergate, in which we had people hired by operatives of the President of the United States to commit a burglary. I mean, insanity. But you got to understand something. In this history, there's been a long kind of tradition, long-standing tradition of folks like the FBI or the CIA of collecting intelligence data. And as you saw during the elections, the issue with Secretary Clinton was her use of emails. Then you saw after the election the president saying he'd been wiretapped by President Obama, President Trump saying that. What all of those folks failed to realize is there are about 17 agencies that collect data, and they share some of it they don't share. Then you have all these foreign agencies with whom they have understandings about sharing data, and there was, of course, a big blow-up about something that the President Trump had shared that we learned from the Israeli security agencies. So people are out here keeping all this data and collecting it. Well, the Pentagon Papers is one of those, and when it hit the press and television, it really set people against, most of the people in the country, against the war in Vietnam, for the simple reason that if you read through those or you looked through those, what became apparent was that our involvement there, our initial involvement was far greater than anybody knew, and our continued involvement was not driven by any kind of objective, but just hoping that the more people we poured in, the better off we do. The bigger the troop surge, the better. If that sounds familiar to you, take it and digest it and think about it. But the bottom line is, this is one of those where, again, his private data, he released this data, and of course, then they had tried to discredit him. And again, another one of these was and this is a thing that ended up going to the Supreme Court. And of course, what I didn't include here as well, if you studied history, is about the tapes that former President Nixon, the late President Nixon, had. He was taping conversations in the White House, and there was a sequence of tapes where he basically incriminated himself, or he involved himself in the obstruction of justice. And this is why he was going to, if he hadn't resigned, he would have been impeached, and he would have lost that impeachment case. There's no doubt about it. A lot of people said, why didn't you burn the tapes? And you have to wonder, but when the tapes were delivered to the Congress, he had just a physical tape recording system. There were 3 or 4 minutes missing on a very crucial day. And that's what turned the Congress against him and the country against him. Because up to that point, about half the people in the country said this is a witch hunt. But then it became apparent, no, it's not a witch hunt. He's trying to hide. And what he's trying to do was suppress the information that the White House had hired, that his aides had hired, with his knowledge, hired people to go commit a burglary. The President of the United States can't do that. It's not kosher. Okay. Now, he can order the foreign forces to take out bad people overseas, but ordering a burglary in the United States ain't going to happen. Not good. So I wanted to alert you to that. It's a little bit of history mixed in there, but again, one of those things where, you know, interestingly, we have this issue of privacy and sharing of information and need to know and all of those kinds of things. So it's some interesting stuff to take a look at and to think about. Now, here's one that's just popped up its head for the people there at Facebook, and this is the issue that Facebook had. I've seen accounts that they had 3,000 accounts that were fake, where people were sending out new stuff, or they were trying to influence people about voting. They were sending out negative ads. 3,000 of them is what people are saying is the count of Facebook accounts opened by Russian operatives. Okay, you got to understand something, and you can go check this out for me. Okay, I'm not someone who hates Russians, but I know how they work, and since the middle 90s, they have developed a very sophisticated way to conduct information war, and they're experts at cyber warfare. One of the first uses of that was in a country called Georgia, which at the end of the Soviet Empire, when the wall fell and the Soviet Union dissolved, Georgia became its own little country. And about 4 or 5 years later, 96, 97, if I'm not mistaken, the Russians Federation decided they wanted them back. And so they began to wage an information campaign. The first thing they did was they took down the Georgian infrastructure and put up a fake infrastructure. The next thing they did was they defaced all of the websites of people there and of all the government officials. The next thing they did was they invaded some of the transmission switching on the media, and then they took the country dark. They took them dark for about three hours. In other words, nobody had phones, no one had internet, nothing. And then they had a group of people there in Georgia who claimed to be persecuted Russians. They said, well, we were being persecuted and we want to be with the Russian Federation so we can be protected. And this insurgent army took that country back. And so they're just like they did in Ukraine, they did the same kind of thing there. So they are very real and something we should be very concerned about with the skills that they have. So Facebook has been asked now to turn over all this data. They were reluctant at first, but now they are. And companies like Facebook, Google, they really are now, Apple, they're walking a tightrope because they're bumping into people, they're bumping into some countries in the world. Like, for example, probably the big prime example would be China, that does not want the kind of internet that you and I have. They want really what amounts to an intranet. And you can go and research this for yourself, but there are certain things that if you use a kiosk over there, you go to an internet coffee bar, or you have your own machine, that if you try to access them, they'll stop you. If you try to access them too many times, you'll probably get a threatening letter. And if you do it too many times, it's the wrong kind of thing. You may even get visited by the authorities. So they have an intranet. North Korea has its own little intranet. So if you were to ask someone from North Korea, do you have an internet? They go, oh yeah, I can search for certain, but could they search for certain? There are certain terms that are filtered out. They can't search on and so forth. So people like Apple and Facebook, Twitter are really coming to grips with this issue. And see, this is this piece of where we have this infrastructure where it's kind of hard to turn it off because stuff's connected. Anyway, there's someone that goes with that case study over there in terms of Eric Snowden. Now, I want to take a little bit of time here to talk about that case. And I'm not going to do the usual thing where I go through your cases. Your responses. I'm going to take a look at that. But what I do think is useful for you and how I will evaluate some of your work is to utilize three kind of templates or three kinds of guides on understanding, okay, how that case should be evaluated. And the first one is going to be over on page 128, okay? And those are the moral dimensions issue. And then you'll see in the middle of page 128, 5 moral dimensions of the information age. And so I'd say the first question you want to ask is, where does he fit in terms of moral dimensions? And this involves the question of information rights, okay? If the United States government is engaged in drone warfare that takes the lives of tremendous numbers of non-combatants, should we know that or not? That's a question that we as a country have. Now, other countries in the world, I think, are not as naive about foreign policy as the United States. We always believe if we go to war, we only go to war because we're right. It has nothing to do with anything saying, well, what's right? Well, read our history carefully and you'll find out sometimes it's not as true. So if we take out a bad person, okay, now, for example, we've renewed our drone attacks there in Syria. So if we take out a bad person, but we kill 20 or 30 people along with that bad person, what about that? Should that information be shared with the American public? And that's an important question. So we have this issue of information rights and obligations. And then they talk about property rights and obligations. Now, you could, I don't know in the Snowden case if you can really talk about property rights or not, okay? I don't think we're really talking about the property of anybody. I don't even believe that kind of stuff is the property of the United States government, if we use the words property per se, okay? So that template might not be useful. Accountability and control. Who's accountable for doing these things? Well, okay, now here's a case where Mr. Snowden decided, okay, he was going to make government accountable by exposing that information. It's the same thing with WikiLeaks, okay? The only problem is what we call the collateral damage. If you publish a list of the 5 CIA operatives in Iran, how long do you think that they're going to be alive? Not too long. Or information that could lead us to lead bad people to find our folks. We get a lot of our information from people on the ground. In other words, there are people in Iran, there are people in North Korea, China, all of these places across the world where we're concerned about what's going on, who are operatives of our government, the United States government, or of the United States government and probably 2 or 3 other Western governments, who are paid to provide information. There are probably people who are deep inside the North Korean government who are there to give us information. And so the question is all right, do we expose those people or not? So the Snowden case is an interesting one, and it's very parallel. It's very much like the issue involving Daniel Ellsberg. And there was another, I'm going to tab, I'd tab on a new tab, and I'll see if I can spell it right. Yeah, the My Lai massacre. Now, and you can go read about this at history.com or wherever. The My Lai massacre was, again, another one of those inflection points where the United States began to turn and say the Vietnam War is not what we should be doing. It's very hard for you to understand, I know this, in today's political climate, that across the United States, with the exception of a few kind of out-of-the-way places, students were protesting, they were up in arms. The country was terribly, terribly divided. even more so than it is today. And the question of should we be in Vietnam or not? Are we defending freedom? What are we actually doing there? You got to remember something. The Vietnam War cost the United States $30 million a day. A day. We lost, I think, 50,000 people. You can go to the wall in Washington and see the memorial. And one of the things that turned it was one of those issues, inflection points, was the My Lai massacre. And this only came to light because of a bunch of very courageous officers who came upon the situation and realized what had happened and reported it. And if they had never, and I'm not, this is just too graphic to pop that up there, but I remember seeing that in the Oklahoma City paper where you saw the rows of these people who were just nothing but villagers laid out. What had happened is there had been a firefight and the troops just went crazy. You gotta remember they were in a situation where they didn't know who's a friend, who's a foe. If that doesn't sound familiar, it should. Yeah, or just they were fighting in jungles and villages instead of urban environments where they didn't know. And instead of improvised explosive devices, they were dealing with tripwires, all kinds of nasty stuff. So, when you have 40, 50, 100 men out in the middle of a jungle and they get scraped up a little bit, and they get a little bit aggravated, and they're carrying a lot of weapons, they can do some damage. And the My Lai massacre is not one of the United States' better moments, but there was many attempts to suppress it. So this fits in. This has been a historical problem for us all the way along. But I wanted to show you that so that you understand that Snowden, there's nothing new about him. He's just dealing with, he's a current version of what we're dealing with. And in addition to applying that moral dimension, there's accountability and control, system quality of life. Then over on page 134, they list the ethical analysis, okay? And in your cases, that's what I hope I saw you do, was take those 5 pieces, okay, and do an analysis of his behavior, starting with, the facts, what happened, the conflict or dilemma, the stakeholders, the options. People who work in the intelligence business, or people who are in the military and are in actively, see a lot of things that happen, and for them becomes a moral dilemma. The United States had one very public dilemma, and this was at the end of the first Iraq War, when the United States Army had trapped the Iranians who were trying to flee from Kuwait. And this is before many of you were born. This is before probably any of you were born. But there was a thing known as the Highway of Death, and this was a highway, a super highway, that led from Kuwait into Iraq. And everything that moved on that highway was blasted to bits. And the international press went through and saw the carnage. And that was what convinced President Bush, the first Bush, to say, I think we need to end this, because it was a horrific set of images. And the United States government, in terms of what it provides information, has gone through an evolution. Back during the Second World War, the government would allow reporters to be embedded with troops. But what had to go back home, this is the Second World War, was stories of their heroism, their courage, their sacrifices, nothing bad. Nothing bad. Same thing in the Korean War. In the Vietnam War, the press was not even hardly allowed. In the war in Afghanistan, Iraq, and the second Iraqi war, and really in the first, the United States government held extensive briefings. You can go on YouTube and see them, where they'd show a smart bomb going into a room. They allowed people to embed reporters in with fighting units and take pictures and ask questions. They were very open. And so that's probably, that door will probably be closed again. But again, you know, if you want templates, I was hoping it would define the conflict or the dilemma, identify the stakeholders, the options that you can reasonably take, and identify the potential consequences of your actions. So that's ethical analysis there in terms of maybe looking at that case and how you would want to evaluate it. Now, the ethical principles there also continue over on page 135. And these are something that not only apply to Eric Stone, they also apply to you and me, all of us. And the risk aversion. So you can tell or see, okay, through the ethical analysis, and then what they call the candidate ethical principles, okay, that application. And so the textbook's taking you through moral, ethical, and then they lead you into what they call professional codes of conduct. And so they're walking you down from those things that we would consider morality issues to the issues of ethics, then down to issues of professional codes of conduct, and then walking you through some of those real world dilemmas. Well, we got started early a little bit, okay? And what I will do is Wednesday, I'll add another webinar for you as I did this, as I did on the 20th, and another 1 or 2 TED guest speakers. And I hope you'll go over there and take a look at those, okay? Thank you so much, and tells me my internet is unstable, so I'm probably going to get garbled at the end of this. So I'm going to stop the share and conclude this. And I do appreciate your time, and you have a good one.